Hi everyone, so today we have here with us Dr. Norman Sandridge. I'm just going to give you a quick intro to him before we start with the interview. Norman Sandridge has a BS in physics with a minor in mathematics by the University of Alabama, a MA in Latin by Florida State University, a MA in Greek by the University of North Carolina, and a Ph.D. in Classics also by the University of North Carolina. He's an Associate Professor of Classics Fellow in Leadership Studies and Greater Washington Outreach at Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies. He's been involved in the development of hybrid online education programs on Classicism, and he also wrote a 2012 book, Loving Humanity, Learning and Being Honored, The Foundations of Leadership in Xenophon's Education of Cyrus. And he also has several essays on leadership published on his Medium account, which I will leave in the description box in the end. So, hi Norman, how are you doing?
I'm very well, Ricardo. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I really
done with the place.
Yeah. So, okay, to start off with, I read your book, and there I noticed that you focus on three main traits that you state are the most valued by ancient thinkers, and particularly in this case Xenophon, when relating to Cyrus and other philosophers. That is philanthropia, the love of humanity, philomatheia, the love of learning, and philotimia, the love of being honored. Could you explain a bit what these things consist of?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and feel free to jump in and interrupt me if I become too long-winded with any of the answers. One thing at the outset, I should point out that I'm a fellow at the Center for Hellenic Studies here, but I'm a professor at Howard University here in Washington, D.C., which is the nation's premier historically black university, founded in 1867. And that's my full-time job, where I teach and do my research and so forth. But back to your question about Xenophon. So Xenophon is a 4th century BCE Athenian author and cavalryman in the Athenian cavalry, well-traveled individual. Was very he traveled to Persia as part of a Spartan campaign to put a prince named Cyrus, not the Cyrus we're about to talk about, but a younger Cyrus, onto the Persian throne. It was ultimately unsuccessful. But in the course of his life, Xenophon became very fluent in and familiar with ancient Persian culture, and the Persians by Xenophon's time had an empire that was a good 150 years old, and seemingly one of the big preoccupations in Xenophon's mind was this question of how did Cyrus come to establish what was at the time the world's first multinational empire, consisting of, like I said, many different nations and even parts of Greece. And it seems to be the case, this is kind of the argument of my book, that Xenophon felt that Cyrus must have possessed three essential traits: the love of humanity, the love of learning, and the love of being honored. And that these traits were key to Cyrus's leadership. But before I tell you about those three traits, would it be okay, Ricardo, if I talk about what leadership means? Because it's a word that we throw around a lot today, and I think it has a pretty specific meaning for Xenophon, and one that I think is worth thinking about. Can I do that part first?
Yeah, of course, go ahead. Yeah.
So if you ask people today what leadership is, or if you Google leadership and you look at leadership programs, a lot of them will focus on the idea that leadership is holding power, or it's wielding power, or it's acquiring power, or it's the ability to influence other people in some way. And there are whole courses you can take on how to climb the ladders of power and become a powerful person, and that gets called leadership. Xenophon talks about this aspect of leadership as well. He's very interested in how it is that people command one another and what counts as successful command or not. But in this work that he wrote on Cyrus, the education of Cyrus, Xenophon is very careful to qualify kind of the real phenomenon that he's interested in, and he's not really interested in being able to give people commands. There's a moment in the first book of the Education of Cyrus where Cyrus is having a dialogue with his father Cambyses, and Cambyses basically breaks down the life of a human being into three aspects that are increasingly important. So he says, at a basic level, it's remarkable or it's important if someone is able to become a good person. Just to start out, independent of your community, your family, just becoming a good person is a remarkable thing. Can you become good, upstanding, decent, noble, even? Doing that's a remarkable thing. The second thing to be able to do is to be able to provide for your family, provide for those nearest and dearest to you through your good character. That's also remarkable. There are plenty of good people in the world who never really turn their goodness outward at all. They might be perfectly honest, decent people, but they're not providers for anyone else. They're not responsible to anyone else. So that's kind of the second level there. And the final level is the one that's most remarkable for Xenophon, and that's this idea. He doesn't, as I say, he doesn't use the word leadership. There's not really a good ancient word that translates as leadership. But what he says is the really remarkable thing for a human being to be able to do is to make it possible for other people, just all of humanity, or someone outside your family, for other people to have what they need in life. That is, have the basic necessities, have what sustains them. And secondly, and maybe even more importantly, for them to become what they need to be. Okay, so a leader for Xenophon is someone who is both someone who can set things up, someone who can set the stage for other people to have what they need and to become what they need to become. Okay, so that's what we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about leadership with Xenophon. Like, yes, there is commanding, yes, there is strategy, yes, there is being in charge, but really, if you want to know, are you doing a wondrous thing in life with your social being or with your political being? Question is, are you providing people with what they need and what they need to become? Okay, is that so far so good?
Yeah, yes, and thank you for the clarification, because I really think it's important for people to know since the very beginning what we're talking about here. And it was really important for you to define leadership in the case of Xenophon and the ancients. So and now I wanted for you to talk about the three main traits, but let's start off with philotimia, perhaps, because I've read in the book, and is again referring to the work of Xenophon about Cyrus. He further divides philotimia into two other aspects. Risk-taking, which is called in Greek philokindunia, and the love of toil, philoponia.
Yeah.
So I guess that from here we get a more accurate sense of what it means to be honorable, in this case to the Hellenists, perhaps.
Yeah, so philotimia is a really fascinating and complex concept in the ancient Greek mind. If you look it up in modern Greek, it's an unambiguously virtuous term. To be philotimo in modern Greek is the highest compliment you can pay someone, and it means something like to be honorable, to be decent, to care about your dignity and your reputation, and really want to be a stand-up person for others. The best way to think about it in the ancient Greek context is that it, as I translated it, it really is the love of being honored. In other words, the idea is at a basic level, you are the kind of person who enjoys being praised, who enjoys being recognized, having statues erected on your behalf, songs sung about you. And if you understand it in that way, you can understand that right away, this is not necessarily a positive thing. The world is full of people who go around grubbing for praise from anyone and everyone. So for Cyrus, it's really important that he seems to be concerned with praise, primarily, if not entirely, praise from other good people, other social people, other well-meaning people. But there are plenty of people in ancient Greece who get called philotimos, who are really just running around getting praise from the masses or getting praise from bad people and so forth. But anyway, so the positive side of that for Cyrus, as you well point out, is this gets back to bring it back to this definition of leadership. We said it was a wondrous thing if someone could provide for others and help them become what they need to become. Well, why would they do that? What would motivate someone to expend the extra effort to amass resources and give them to other people, or to found a school, or try to set a good example for what other people need to become? At least in part, and this is not entirely the case, but at least in part, the love of being honored seems to be what motivates people to do that. It's within us to want that recognition, that appreciation, that acknowledgement. And as you say, that if you want those things, the idea is that you will work harder than the average person. That you will, ponos is toil, it's labor. It can often be thought of, as physical labor, but it could be, staying up late at night and really, investing the extra time to solve a problem. And as far as philokindunia goes, as far as risk-taking goes, the ancient leader was expected to risk his or her life in all sorts of different capacities. It might be risking your actual life by engaging in battle, participating in the front lines of battle. Many ancient leaders, even if they were, as politicians, they were often expected to command armies and fight in the forefront of the army. Sometimes they would even bring their families along and risk their families' lives. So there's that aspect of it. There's also the aspect of risking your personal finances, using your own wealth to go on a military campaign or invest in some expedition, a colony on the behalf of your people. So there's the financial side, and of course there's always the reputational side. Anytime you put yourself out there and you say, I want honor, you're automatically opening yourself up for dishonor, right? If you go out on a stage and you say, hey, I want to do this great thing, some people will like it and some people will probably criticize it. I have a friend who's a congressman here in DC, and he says, if you want to know what your virtues are, you have to go to your own funeral. But if you want to know what your vices are, all you have to do is run for office and then read the internet, because people will have things to say about you. So, but again, the idea is if you are someone who really cares about being held in high esteem by good people, you'll do that. That's one motive. So that's just starting out with philotimia. I think you have questions about that? Or?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I guess that when we join together these two aspects from philotimia, philokindunia, and philoponia, that we get the sense that to be honorable in the eyes of Xenophon is to be someone that as a leader decides to carry a heavy burden, a heavy load in the name of the society at large, and to do some very difficult tasks that are necessary in order to keep perhaps society in order and to further perhaps society in terms of development, even perhaps, because to keep progress, to keep up with progress, people have to face some very hard tasks. And so I think that you get this sense that a leader has to sacrifice himself in some way or another by having on his back and carry the load that other people are not willing to carry, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. If not sacrifice himself or herself, at least risk herself, and really put it out there. And this might be a good time. You mentioned the word progress. It might be a good time to talk about in any leadership situation. There's always the question. We talked about leadership as providing people with what they need and what they need to become. Well, what do they need? What do people need, and what do people need to become? For Xenophon, at least in the case of Cyrus, the final image he leaves us with Cyrus, and it's one that Xenophon says doesn't really last as long as Cyrus's own, or it starts to crumble as soon as Cyrus dies. But the picture of the Persian Empire is one that is highly organized, even to say bureaucratic. It's got a large administrative system for bringing in resources, tribute from the entire Persian Empire, and then redistributing that tribute according to what everyone needs. And the idea is that if you have the right kind of leader at the top of that that organizational structure, then you can get the flow of what people have and take it to what people need. And so that's their kind of material sustenance. And the other part of it is Cyrus seems to regularly create opportunities for other people to be virtuous and for them to win honor and distinction. So what should a person become in Cyrus's conception? They should become good and honorable the way Cyrus is, for the most part. They're never going to become as good and honorable, but the idea is to create those opportunities for them.
Yeah, and another interesting thing that Xenophon refers to is that, and I think this is also included inside philotimia, is that a leader has also to be a modest person, and he refers to the word aidemon and obedient to his elders, and I don't know if there's any word that refers particularly to this or not, and even devoted to some more mundane jobs, like, for example, he refers to the specific case of being devoted to the horses, so fili potatus.
Yeah.
So all these traits fall again under the rubric of doing what, in the eyes of the other people, will render you an honorable person. Right.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The Greek word eidos, we often translate it as shame or reverence. I mean, it's really something like the capacity to blush when someone you respect calls you out. Like you will care that your community is approving or disapproving of your actions, and you will strive to do actions that are approved by your community, assuming they're good.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think that in order to be a leader in this case, we're walking here a very narrow path, because I mean the person on the one hand has to be aware of her value to be a leader, to know that she can be a leader and to feel safe, let's say, being a leader, don't retract herself from that job. But on the other hand, the person also has to be modest. So she kind of has to equilibrate the two aspects.
Yeah, modesty in this context, I think, just means don't exaggerate. In other words, if you really are good at something, there's nothing wrong saying, you know, I am good at this. But in other words, so it's not like, you know, in the modern world, sometimes if you get an honor or something, and you know, let's say you win a spelling bee, we might expect you to say, well, I'm not really that good of a speller, or I just got lucky or something. That's kind of our version of modesty. But Cyrus doesn't really downplay his achievements. He just doesn't exaggerate them. So it's knowing exactly what your competency is, and also always pushing yourself to strive for more, and always entering into new contests and taking on new challenges. There's a really, if I can do it in just 30 seconds, there's a great anecdote. When Cyrus is a young man, he has kind of a dual education. He's raised in Persia, but he spends time in the Median court of his grandfather Astyages. And one of the things that the Medes are really good at is horse riding. And Cyrus is not trained to ride a horse in Persia, but he wants to get good at riding horses. So he decides to challenge all of his friends there in Media to ride horses. And he knows that they're going to be better than him. He knows that they're going to win and so forth. But he does this enough that eventually he becomes a better horseman than they are. So that's it. That's again, it's part of his reverence. Like he doesn't want to cause any offense, but he also wants to challenge himself and be up to par with his different community. And there's kind of a whole trope in the ancient world about the leader who can go to different communities and excel at their different, you know, skills. Like to be well versed in that is seen as really remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Right. And now about philanthropia, because I think this is a very tricky Greek word, because it would be translated directly into English perhaps as something like the love of humanity.
Yeah.
But this could suggest a feeling felt by a fortunate person of high status for the poor and the downtrodden and so on. But in the context of Cyrus, it is more of an affection, a gentleness, a concern for fairness, an encouragement of other people, and a versatile ability to blend in, right? It's more of this sort of thing, right?
Yes, that's all very well said. In fact, just yesterday at the Hellenic Center here, I did a workshop with some college students on the ancient idea of philanthropia and the modern term philanthropy, and I was asking the students kind of what is a philanthropist today. And one of the students said very flippantly, but I thought very intuitively, that it's a socialite who wants a job. You know, it's basically, you know, someone who's in a privileged position and, you know, isn't, you know, a titan of industry, or, you know, isn't involved in any other project. So they just want to, you know, they have this excess wealth and they want to decide how to allocate it. And that's called philanthropy. But as you say, with Cyrus and in another ancient Greek context, the basic idea is that you are a philos. That's the Greek word for a friend. You are a philos to your fellow human beings. Okay, and everything that you might associate, well, not everything, but a lot of the things you might associate friendly behavior with, things like you know, gestures of affection, giving of gifts, hosting someone, taking an interest in someone's misfortune, or taking an interest in someone's success, where you celebrate their success with them. That's what being a philos to humans is. And in the case of Cyrus, it is kind of, I mean, it's both a social distancer, because the person who's really good at philanthropia is in a way above the person that's receiving the philanthropia. The person receiving the philanthropia doesn't reciprocate by showing philanthropia to the philanthropist, as it were, right? It's not a two-way reciprocal kind of thing on that level, especially when we're talking about really grand gestures, and Cyrus did engage in that kind of gift giving, but it's but there's also this element of intimacy. It does mean a fondness, a willingness to get to know someone, physical affection, blending in like you're like family to the person. And so as far as the importance of philanthropia, again, this brings us back to this idea of what is the really wondrous thing that Cyrus is all about, providing for others and helping them become what they need to become. Why would you do that? Because if you're a philanthropos, you're not just concerned about yourself. You're not just concerned about your immediate family members or even your local tribe. You're the kind of person who derives pleasure from seeing other people succeed and prosper. It doesn't matter if you know them intimately or not. Just the sheer success of another human being gladdens your heart, and it gladdens your heart even more if you can win honor by being the kind of person who helped that fellow human being. Is that helpful?
Yeah, yes, it was. So, and there's also the idea of philanthropia being something like getting close to other people, but not too close. And I would like to refer to Paul Bloom's work, because last year he published a very interesting book called Against Empathy. And I think that it really goes well with this, because he differentiates between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. And he says that we should struggle to have cognitive empathy toward other people, to know what they're going through, but not really to connect or to try to feel emotionally what the other person is feeling, because that can become a heavy load on us, and then we eventually decide to not help the other person, because next to her we feel bad, because we're experiencing psychologically and emotionally the same thing as the person is experiencing, and we can't really help the other person when we're experiencing those things. So, and it's really interesting, because he also talks about some experiments neuroscientists done with Mathieu Ricard, the Buddhist monk, the happiest man on earth, supposedly, and with fMRI, and they asked him to imagine a person which was in distress, and to feel what the other person was feeling, and then on the other exercise, to imagine the same thing but without feeling what that person was feeling. And he is able to do that because he trained himself a lot mentally, and in the end they asked him what he went through, and he said that in the first test, when he was feeling what the other person was feeling, that he felt really bad and he didn't want to help the other person. But in the second task, when he was just imagining someone going through a bad situation and not feeling emotionally what the other person was feeling, that he felt good, he felt liberated, and he wanted to help the other person. So do you think that from the work of Xenophon we could also make an association with this knowledge?
I think it's possible. I mean, I'm aware of the distinction that you're talking about. Sometimes the terminology in the literature on psychopathy is what they call hot empathy and cold empathy, and I think that's the same, the cognitive and emotional empathy that you're talking about there. a couple, and if you haven't looked at it, there's a lot of literature in the healthcare field on the level of empathy, let's say, a nurse or a doctor should show for a patient. On the one hand, as you say, it can become very fatiguing if let's say a nurse is dealing with patients all the time and they're dying all the time, and the nurse is grieving with the family of the deceased and so forth. That can be very fatiguing. But at the same time, we all, I think, from the perspective of a patient, you like to believe that what you're feeling is not just understood by other people, but it's felt by other people. That you have a kinship and a connection with them, and they're not just looking at you the way you might look at a car that needs to be fixed. I mean, because you're not. It's not a cold mechanic kind of thing. So I think it's very tricky. As I was saying before, with Xenophon, philanthropia does involve actually showing sympathy, and it involves showing rejoice when someone succeeds. When it's not, you don't just say, I understand what your happiness feels like. You don't say that. You're like, hey, I'm so happy for you. That's great. Pat you on the back. Like you really, and that's one of the joys of philanthropia. That's part of if you're the kind of person who can take pleasure in the success of others, that charges your batteries. Now, but again, by the same token, philanthropia involves showing sympathy or regret when someone suffers something badly. Yes, it can become taxing and fatiguing, but it also, I think, makes that person feel better to know that someone it's kind of a way of dispersing or diffusing the feeling. I'm not saying this as a psychologist, so it's not a recommendation on my part, but I think that's how Xenophon processes it. Although, as you say, even in the ancient world, there is a sensitivity to either what you might call the fatigue of caring about everybody, or even it's an anxiety or a stress. If you're the leader of a multinational empire and you have thousands of people in your care, you simply can't lament for all of them all of the time. And one of the ways that Cyrus gets around that later in his life is he just sets up kind of a hierarchical system where he has 10 people that he's closest to, his 10 best friends or whatever, and they have 10 people each, and then it just goes on down the pyramid that everybody is responsible for the 10 in their group or something, and that seems to minimize the anxiety. But for the most part, I think Xenophon just imagined that Cyrus was remarkably capable of processing other people's misfortunes and their joys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but perhaps as a leader he had to keep some distance, at least from the majority of people, otherwise he wouldn't be able to keep psychologically stable in order to be a leader, right?
Well, and this gets into what we might call the advantages of being psychopathic, or in some situation. And by the way, I'm not advocating psychopathic leadership. I'm just saying I think it can be adaptive in those situations. The psychopath feels no guilt or remorse or even what they call hot empathy for other people. The psychopath might understand the physiology and the behavior of someone who's in love, but they themselves don't feel that. And arguably, some researchers have argued that this actually helps you in a leadership situation. You might be interested to know that there's a psychologist based out of Oxford named Kevin Dutton, who he's written a book on how he thinks Buddhists, for example, and saints and these figures have actually achieved a level of psychopathy because they shut down on that emotional level and process everything kind of cerebrally according to a master plan, which is a divine plan, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we will also talk more specifically about about that. But just to end the discussion about the three main traits of leadership to Xenophon, then we have philomatheia.
Yes.
That is the disposition to investigate, to learn more. I would like you to comment on what is philomatheia to Xenophon and others, but also about the following idea. Do you think that philomatheia here works for a leader as a trait that he has that allows him to explore further, and perhaps while he is turning into a leader and substituting former leaders, people that are already old and perhaps don't have the sense or the feeling for the changes that occur during their lives, and perhaps the dangers that lurk around, and that at the moment the new leader has to attend to? Wouldn't you say that perhaps philomatheia here would work as a trait that would allow this new leader to see beyond what the leader that came before him was capable of seeing, and lead his society toward progress, or whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, well, let's come. This is a really interesting question. Let's come back to it after I've said a little bit about how I understand Xenophon and the idea of philomatheia. And it is probably worth pointing out that Xenophon seems to have Plato in mind, at least to some extent. He's writing a little bit after Plato's Republic, where, as you know, of course, the idea of philosophia, or the love of wisdom, is really what guides the leader. Xenophon doesn't use that word very much at all to describe philosophia as a trait of a leader. But for Plato, and there's a longer discussion of this, but for Plato, philosophia is a love of finding kind of that abstract oneness that binds everything together. You take any set of material objects and find out what their essence is, and then take another set of material objects and find out what that essence is, and then figure out what the essence of those two essences are, and so forth and so on. And that's what philosophia kind of is for Plato. For Xenophon, philomatheia seems to be kind of a much more practical quality. That is, it's the ability, it's curiosity. It's someone, it's someone for whom learning is a friend. Like, you're a friend to learning. You just you're constantly asking questions. Why is this? Why is that? You're constantly retaining new information. And for Xenophon too, the idea is that you're a quick study, that you really, as you're investigating and learning things, you pick up on it faster than everybody else does. And one of the ways that, so Xenophon thinks that Cyrus is kind of born this way. He just has a soul that is inclined to be inquisitive and learn things really quickly. But Cyrus is also trained in his education to have philomatheia. And one of the ways you train someone, particularly to learn about justice, is even as a little boy, you have them try cases among their peers. So you're out practicing the hunt or something, and somebody accidentally hits somebody else with a sword. You would have a court case then and there, and one of the other boys would be expected to try that case and ask, did you hit him on purpose with the sword? Was it an accident? Were there any witnesses? Like, what's the real charge here? And figure out what's going on. And as you're doing that, someone is watching you in your as a little boy in your investigation. And by practicing those cases, it puts you in the habit of asking questions and paying attention to the answer. It's an affinity for learning, both in terms of you're interested in it and you're quick at it. So again, to tie this back to what we were saying about what is leadership for Xenophon, if you want to, if your job is to provide for people's needs and your job is to help people become what they need to become, you're going to have to be pretty, inquisitive about that. It's not obvious what people need or how they are going to get their needs or what they need to become. Let's come back to your question that you were asking about someone a philomatheia who is replacing another leader.
Mm-hmm.
What do
Yes.
you? Yeah. Could you say that question again?
Yes, what I was trying to ask was that let's say that there's a new leader that is going to replace an old leader, and I imagine that when that happens, and because the old leader was trained when he was young to perhaps be aware of certain problems that could go on in his society, or perhaps that could involve his enemies, or some kind of menace that could be lurking around, and things like that, that when the new leader comes, because he was born after the previous one, he also comes equipped, let's say, with new knowledge that he should apply, and he is able to see things that perhaps the old leader was blind to, and perhaps even to avoid for his society to go down into chaos or something like that, because maybe the previous person wasn't able to see certain kinds of troubles going around, because she was already used to do things as
Right.
she always did. You know what I mean? And
Right.
perhaps philomatheia would work here as the means for, or the psychological trait for, the new leader to be able to explore unexplored territory, let's say.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and as usual, Xenophon has a pretty good example of this. This is in it's in book 1 of the Education of Cyrus, in the 4th chapter. It turns out that some of the Medes are out on a hunt, and the Assyrians, who are their rivals, their enemies, have decided to go hunting on their own in Median territory, and they threaten the Medes by kind of encroaching upon their land and kind of acting like they're going to take over if they can or whatever. And all of the other Medes are very cautious, including the king of the Medes, Astyages, who is Cyrus's grandfather. And it's Cyrus who kind of spontaneously on the spot says, what if we do X, Y, and Z? You go here, I go here, my uncle goes over here, and he puts together a plan right away, because he's so vigilant, and he's always looking for new opportunities that, as you say, someone who's more established in their ways or of an older generation is just used to, it's kind of a blind spot for them. They don't see those new opportunities. By the way, if you're interested in evolutionary psychology, there's a really interesting article by the evolutionary psychologist named Van Vugt, Mark. I think it's Mark Van Vugt, Vanvugt. I can send it to you. It's called "The Faces of Leadership," and he identifies, or he hypothesizes that there are 4 kind of basic faces that leaders have, all of which correspond to given leadership situations. You want me to give you a breakdown of those really quickly? Or
Yeah, of course.
I don't want us to get too far off on a tangent. I'll give you one of them, and you can look up the other 3 if you want. One of the faces of leadership is competence. Okay, a competent face in traditional societies is an older face. It's a wrinkled face. It's maybe it's an uneven face. It's a face that's been through some battles and has scars, and it's a face when we look to it and we want traditional knowledge to solve a problem. Like we feel like as a society we've lost our ways, and this person is going to bring us back. We're drawn to a competent face, evolutionarily speaking. But the competent face, Van Vugt argues, has 2 aspects to it. One is in situations where there is traditional knowledge required, but there are also situations where new knowledge is required, like new scientific discoveries, technological discoveries, maybe cultural discoveries. Hey, we've just learned that there's another group of people out there we didn't know existed, and we want to make friends with them, or we want to trade with them, or something like that. In those situations, we're not drawn to the older, more wrinkled face, but we're drawn to the younger, kind of optimistic, open-eyed face. Think of someone like Mark Zuckerberg, who's actually, people think is flirting with the presidential bid, sometime in his future. Van Voogt's point is, if you're the kind of society who senses that we need to go in new directions, you would be drawn to that younger face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting, and I didn't know about that work. So,
yeah.
But wouldn't you say then that in order to be a good leader, according to Xenophon and the others, and because he also talks about the importance of being respectful of the elders and of gathering the knowledge that also comes from the elders, that on the one hand a leader should do that and should keep the essential structures of society in place that were set up by people who came before him, but on the other hand, to be able to deal with new problems that might arise, that he should join together with that this polymatheia tendency to be able to deal with new problems that might arise in society, and with a renewed vision, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, and that's where you've hit upon another delicate balance that the leader has to strike. And I mean, you said it very well, in that it's revering tradition, respecting tradition, but also kind of gently pushing that tradition in a new direction. So in that situation, you're simultaneously playing the follower of the tradition, and you're the leader of the tradition. In some cases, you may need to overturn the tradition or upend the tradition. One of the things that Cyrus does so interestingly, I won't say it makes it good leadership, but it's very interesting, that he brings together the Median traditions and the Persian traditions, and and those are not necessarily compatible or reconcilable. So, for example, the Persians dressed very modestly in Xenophon's conception, very modestly, ate very sparsely, whereas the Medes dressed very lavishly and ate, participated in lavish banquets. And Cyrus actually adopts that, even though he's still king of the Persians. So in some ways he really upends the tradition, but he tries to do it. This is where the delicate balance comes in. He tries to do it in a way that seems natural and consistent with the values of the community he comes from. But it's not always easy to do. Like, there are several times when Cyrus is technically playing the leader, but he casts himself as someone's son or someone's nephew, playing this kind of dutiful role. But it's very clear Cyrus is completely in charge in what he's doing. He's just paying respect to one of his elders.
Mm-hmm. And so we get a sense from Xenophon that we have these three main traits, but we are not reduced to them, that they are further divided into other aspects, and it is not enough to say, oh, you have to have a philanthropia, philomatheia, and philotimia, because then they are further divided into other aspects. And, for example, the leader has to attend to the needs of the people at the top of the hierarchy, but also of the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, if he wants to keep society cohesive and stable. He has to have this very particular sense of love of humanity, of getting close but not too close. He has to love learning, so partially he would probably have to be a scholar. And he also needs to have to know how to deal with mundane problems, like, for example, attending to horses, and things like that, and perhaps also to know how to fight and how to be a good warrior, at least in the ancient sense of it.
Yeah.
So we get this variety of competencies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing I would say about that is, a lot of people like to reduce leadership to 3 traits or 10 rules or 12 rules or whatever, as though simply memorizing those and trying to go out and apply them haphazard. Like if you go out and you say like, okay, I want to be a leader and I'm going to be sure to love humanity, love honor, and love learning in every situation, like that's probably not going to get you very far. I mean, really, these are just these are starting points or principles, you might say, that involve like ongoing thought, and that you need to really hone your judgment as a leader by applying these ideas and even questioning them. Not just apply them, but ask like, is this really it? Maybe there's a 4th trait you need to have, or a 5th trait, or maybe these traits are not properly conceived. You've got to be continually second guessing and rethinking and reapplying. And the hope is, you do it 1,000 times or more, then that will evolve into wisdom. But there's no like Rosetta Stone or no DNA of leadership that just allows you to kind of mechanically or algorithmically go on to lead the way you would solve a problem in mathematics or something.
Exactly. So, and now could you talk a little bit about the influence Socrates might have had over Xenophon and Plato, and the main distinctions between the two? Because I get the sense that, for example, when Plato talks about the virtues of going after what is beautiful, what is good, and what is true, in a way I get the sense that what is true would be connected with philomatheia in this case, because you have this tendency to explore and to search for new knowledge and etc., and to try to get perhaps at what is true, and on the other hand, philanthropia would be connected with what is good, perhaps.
Yeah, but possibly not, right? I mean, philanthropia is connected with the good if you assume that the only way to love a person is to do what's good for them. Maybe that's true. In other words, like you would never tell someone a falsehood just to make them feel better. I could see someone who was a philanthropic person saying like, yeah, it's okay to lie to someone or mislead them if it makes them feel better. But I don't think Plato would think that's a good idea. Plato doesn't really develop the idea of philanthropia very much, because I think he's so concerned with wisdom. Now, as to your question about Plato's version of Socrates versus Xenophon's version of Socrates, to answer that question, it would really be like to say, what is the difference between Plato and Plato and Xenophon? Because Socrates is quite often the vehicle that both of these thinkers use to present their own ideas. And who was the historical Socrates? Was the historical Socrates even more like one version than another? As I'm sure you probably know, seems to be a consensus among Plato scholars that at some point Plato completely did away with the idea of presenting Socrates as a historical figure and was just very consciously using him as a vehicle for his own ideas. I'm open to the idea that Plato was always using Socrates as a vehicle for his ideas, and maybe we'll never know who the actual Socrates was. I mean, think about how many different ways that people have talked about Jesus, and how much kind of their own ideas and their own background influenced their presentation and their understanding of Jesus. I will maybe one. So anyway, I'll just say it would be a 6-hour conversation to try to put to parse them. I will say that there's an interesting distinction even in the ancient world, and it gets picked up later in the Renaissance about Plato's ideal leader versus Xenophon's idealized leader in Cyrus. And that is, people would praise Xenophon in the ancient world for giving us an example, supposedly an example of an idealized leader in Cyrus, whereas the philosopher king seemed to be so remote and so unattainable. Maybe the philosopher king is a better leader, but at least Cyrus is a plausible leader. Now, I certainly wouldn't say that Xenophon's version of Cyrus is the same as the historical Cyrus, what we can know about him, but that gives you some sense for what the two thinkers are doing. Xenophon, is much more, we might say, concerned with the practical, with actual examples, what he thinks are actual examples that people can follow, based on historical figures than Plato is.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you already talked a little bit about the psychopathic personality and its relationship with leadership. I mean, the psychopathic personality includes things like charm, fearlessness, boldness, disregard for convention, willingness to step on toes to get things done, versatility, fluid public speaking, and so on and so forth. So you already said that perhaps one of the traits coming from psychopaths that could be useful for a leader was the fact that they are more easily able to distance themselves from other people emotionally, and so to deal with them more from the perspective of cognitive empathy, perhaps, instead of emotional empathy. So, apart from this, what are the other traits that come from psychopaths that you think can be useful for a person as a leader?
Yeah, well, again, we have to come back to that question. So there are a lot of psychopathic traits that are useful for someone wanting to maintain a leadership role. Okay, so like if that's your thing, if you want the status of a leader, you want to hold power, you want the prestige of the role, then yes, a whole look at the United States president right now, like pathological lying, what they call grandiosity. A belief that you are actually more competent at something than you really are. If you just going by quotes from President Trump, like he knows more history, he knows more about the economy, he knows more about the taxes, and maybe he doesn't believe that. Maybe he knows that he's lying. But a true grandiose person and a true psychopath actually believes that there is something special and remarkable about them, that only a few people can understand them, that they're anointed and things like that. And so those kinds of things, I think, fairly straightforwardly, help someone hold a position of leadership, at least in some contexts. So on that level, does it make you a good leader? Well, it makes you a leader, right? It allows you to continue to be the leader. And in those situations, you don't even have to be all that curious. Like, not every head of state or powerful leader in human history was very curious or very knowledgeable. They knew how to manipulate people through what you're calling cognitive empathy. They could read people, they could play people off one another, they could manipulate the truth. They weren't held back by feelings of guilt or compunction, so they could kill indiscriminately and not feel remorse. But really, the hard question, and we should just talk about this. You shouldn't ask me or expect me to have an answer, because it's a hard question. The hard question is: does someone with psychopathic with psychopathic tendencies or abilities actually provide? Is that person a good provider for what other people need? And is that kind of person the kind of person who will help people become what they need to become? Right? So what do you think?
What do I think?
Okay.
It's a bit difficult to say, but I guess that one of the traits, another trait that psychopaths have that could be useful, and even recently I read a little bit of evolutionary psychology about this trait, because I read the work, I can't remember the name of the person now, but she was talking about evolutionary psychology when applied to analyzing bullying. And one interesting thing that she concluded is that one trait that bullies have, and perhaps we can connect with with psychopathic tendencies, is that they really believe in themselves, and they really think that they can get things done. So they have a real elevated sense of self, and so I would say that in this case, someone to be a leader, and because leaders are constantly put under a lot of stress, that if the person doesn't have a high self-esteem and doesn't believe, even if it is, or even if in the first view it seems almost impossible to achieve certain things, if that person doesn't believe in herself, that she wouldn't make a good leader, perhaps.
Yeah. So you're talking about grandiosity there, and I would say, maybe some bullies do have grandiosity. The question is, it's not just believing in yourself, but it's actually believing that you're something greater than you actually are. This is what psychopaths have, and I suspect it's probably what bullies have. In other words, if you ask a psychopath, do you know world history? Take a guess. Ask the psychopath to guess how much world history do you know? Do you know more than 50% of the population or something? Like, psychopaths will say yes. They might even say, I know 90% or 95%, whereas someone who's not psychopathic, someone who is, let's say, conscientious on the big five, the big trait, if you're super conscientious, you tend to be thinking in your head of all the things that you don't know. So if you ask, I'm a pretty conscientious person. If you ask me, yes, what do I know about world history, I will immediately start ticking off in my head all the things that I don't know about world history, and I will probably exaggerate my ignorance. I might actually say, I only know, I'm only in the top 50% of human beings, because I can name all these things that I don't know about. Whereas, again, the psychopath doesn't do that. The psychopath emphasizes what they do know, and they're very good at marshaling what little knowledge they do have to give off the impression of expertise. Like a used car salesman. Do you have used car salesmen in Portugal?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, that's a thing in the United States. Someone who's always like exaggerating an inferior product, right? So again, if you ever watch Trump in a rare televised meeting, you can see that he knows one or two things about the topic. Like, he'll get briefed and he'll learn one or two things, and he can actually utilize those one or two you wouldn't even be able to pass a high school test on the subject with this bit of information. But in a rhetorical situation, in a leadership situation, he can spin that up and make it seem like he's a real authority. So again, yes, that will put you in a position of leadership, and maybe it will also inoculate you against the criticism that we know we're going to face, that a leader knows they're going to face. Remember that idea of philotimia. The minute you put yourself out there, you've got to be willing to take that risk. And so if you're grandiose, yeah, it'll kind of flow off your back a little bit, and you can carry on in that leadership role. But again, is that good, or should the lesson just be to our society, don't be so critical of your leaders? Like, be fair to your leaders. Like, don't put your leaders in a situation where they have to, where you're only going to get the boastful ones in office. Because if you're hypercritical of your leaders, if you're unfairly critical of leaders, you will only get braggarts for your leaders, right? A modest person a person with reverence and respect is not going to want to put themselves out there and be constantly criticized. So again, it would come back to this question of, yeah, you can hold the leadership role, but are you really giving people what they need and turning them into what they need to become?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. But let's put it another way. Because, I mean, to be a leader, you have to acquire certain knowledge and to develop certain competencies. So I guess that if we put the grandiosity thing at a moderate level, that a leader, to be an effective leader, let's say that someone wants to have a certain leadership position, and and it's impossible for anyone to have all the necessary competencies to hold that position, that the person has to get there, and then with time and with their abilities to develop a little bit more those traits and those competencies. So wouldn't you say that at least in a moderate level, that in order for a leader to be effective, he has to be somewhat grandiose, to believe in himself and to believe that he is able to do the task at hand, and to so let's say, for example, if Churchill didn't believe in himself, perhaps he would not have been able to do what he had to do in order to keep the United Kingdom safe, or moderately safe at least, because they were still attacked by the Germans, but to be able to keep the United Kingdom relatively safe during the Second World War.
Yeah, well, I mean, there where we'd have to argue a counterfactual history, right, and imagine a less grandiose Churchill. I guess what I don't know Churchill's own biography or skill set well enough to know this, whether Churchill had an accurate, I mean, it's fine if you're, let's say you're a good orator and you call yourself a good orator and you believe you're a good orator. There is such a thing as a good and a bad orator. Like that's a real thing. And so if you're a good orator, there's nothing wrong with believing that you're a good orator. The question is there any value to believe, if you're a good orator, is there any advantage to believing that you're a great orator? That's the trickier question. And there's actually a researcher at Emory University named Scott Lilienfeld, who has he's done a lot of work on narcissism and grandiosity and psychopathy. And he has an article, I don't remember the exact title, it's something called like the double-edged sword of grandiose narcissism or grandiosity. And he talks about how, in a typical democratic political environment, thinking more highly of yourself than you deserve can serve to insulate you. Like you can get through the slings and arrows of a political campaign or criticism when you're in office. But people like that also tend to commit ethical violations at a greater rate, because they tell themselves they're special, that they're above the law, that it doesn't matter if I get caught, because the gifts I'm bestowing to my community so far outweigh any corruption I might be engaging in. So again, we come back to that question of what is good for the society, or what does the society need? And it's tricky.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. But you've also been studying Alcibiades. What psychopathic traits do you think Alcibiades had? And do you think that he was a real psychopath or not?
Yeah, okay, so this is again one of those how much time do you have kinds of questions. So let's remember who Alcibiades was. He was a 5th century Athenian statesman, lived in the latter half of the 5th century, and was kind of heir to what some researchers have called the golden age of Athens, established by Pericles, who died in the plague in Athens just at the beginning of the war, the Peloponnesian War with the Spartans, and Alcibiades kind of inherited that. And we don't know very much about Alcibiades as a historical figure. The moment you try to understand who a historical leader was, you run into all sorts of challenges. Just as you do now, trying to understand a contemporary leader. There's bias, there's access to information, there's interpreting the information, all kinds of things like that. But the one source that I really have spent a lot of time looking at is the 1st century CE biographer Plutarch, who wrote a number of biographies about ancient leaders, and he does write one of Alcibiades. And I do believe, I don't believe that Plutarch had exactly the same construct of psychopathy in his mind that he was applying to Alcibiades, but I think it turns out that a great many, probably 8 or 10 or more traits that he shows Alcibiades having are what we would acknowledge today are modern psychopathic traits with the modern construct of psychopathy. And I'm not the first person to observe this. One of the great researchers of psychopathy in the 20th century, Hervey Cleckley, noticed in his book Mask of Sanity that Alcibiades seemed to have a lot of these traits. And for him, for Cleckley, psychopathy was this weird phenomenon where someone could present as otherwise intelligent and competent and sociable, and yet they were always doing something to undermine their success. They were taking risks that they shouldn't be taking. They were manipulating people even when it didn't make that much sense for them to manipulate them. They were impulsive. They were reckless. Kind of trickster figures. And that was kind of Cleckley's understanding. And in the 20 or 30 years since Cleckley's research, we've obviously become much more sophisticated with fMRI scans and understanding the workings of the brain, and psychopathy really does seem to have a lot to do with the amygdala and the other parts of the brain that process emotion, kind of a lower emotional registry, not understanding love very well, not feeling pity or remorse or guilt or things like that. Anyway, Alcibiades seems to have, if you go to the modern construct as of just 4 or 5 years ago, Alcibiades seems to be even more like the modern psychopath. One of the traits, this is one of the traits that I find most relevant to thinking about leadership is this question of how versatile does a leader need to be, again, in order to provide people with what they need and help them become what they need to become. How versatile? In other words, does a leader need to be funny? Does a leader need to be serious? Does a leader need to be a truth teller? Does a leader need to be a liar? Does a leader need to know how to party? And Alcibiades, interestingly, Alcibiades seems to have been able to pull off all of these kind of moves, and that is part and parcel of the psychopathic behavior. The psychopath, one of the things that turned me on to this idea that Alcibiades might be a psychopath is I was reading this book by Robert Hare, who's one of the foremost researchers in psychopathy, called Snakes and Suits, and he talks about how in a business setting, the psychopath is often a chameleon-like figure. That is to say, if let's say you and I work at a company together, and I'm a psychopath, like I would go up to you and try to learn your backstory, and I would say, Ricardo, tell me something about your father.
Mm-hmm. About something about my father. Well, my father worked in a bank, so. Oh, and he's very conscientious, I guess.
Yeah, that's so interesting. My dad, worked at a bank for 10 years, and he really, he had a good time. Did your dad like working at a bank?
Oh yeah, he liked it a lot.
My dad did too. Like it was really amazing. He had a great. I'm lying. I'm totally lying when I tell you this, but that's what the psychopath does. And then so I build a rapport with you. I blend in. In other words, I'm changing my persona to adapt. Now I have a father who's like your father. And then as we're talking, I build a rapport with you, and I say, you know, Ricardo, Sally over there said something really ugly about you at work the other day. She said, you know, you come from such a highfalutin background because your dad was a banker, and she thought that, you know, you were holding that over her. Like, you know, is there some problem between the two of you? And then you confide in me, and now you know that Sally doesn't like you, and then you say, well, yeah, Sally was really hard to work with on a project the other day. Then I go to Sally and I say, yeah, Ricardo, said you were difficult to work with on a project. And so by doing so, I'm blending in. I'm being the chameleon for both of you. And then by doing that, I have sort of created for myself a little hub where now I'm getting gossip from both of you. I'm pitting you against each other. And then, you know, people know that Ricardo and Sally don't get along in the office. So when it comes time for a promotion, who are they going to promote but the guy who seemingly gets along with everybody? And that's how, you know, that's the chameleon-like behavior of the psychopath, and that's something that Plutarch talks about way back, you know, 2,500 years with Alcibiades, that he could go and live among the Spartans and eat the Spartan gruel. He could, live lavishly among Ionian Greeks. He could drink heavily with the Thracians. He could just, you know, be whatever that community needed him to be, or whatever he needed. Plutarch is very clear about that Alcibiades is being predatory. A chameleon is actually a predator, and the word in Greek is chamaileon. It means a lion who is on the ground, a ground lion. So the chameleon is a predator and someone who is always looking for an opportunity to take advantage by blending in. And so I find it very interesting that this is a psychopathic trait. Obviously, we don't want our leaders taking advantage of this in this way, and yet it seems like we often expect leaders to change their skin, as it were, in different settings. That they have to know how to play lots of different roles and not stumble over them. So you have to be funny, you have to be serious. Maybe sometimes you have to lie. And you have to lie convincingly, because the truth doesn't need to get out. You don't want your enemies to know about the truth, so maybe you have to lie to your own people. And that's something that a chameleon or a psychopathic chameleon is known for.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And now to change to another topic, because in one of your Medium articles, a very interesting one, you referred to the hero's journey. And for people who don't know, the hero's journey comes from the work of Joseph Campbell. And you applied the hero's journey to, let's say, a new kind of way of teaching students at universities. Were you thinking about applying the hero's journey to create new leaders? And I'm asking because you focus a lot on leadership, or to create better citizens in general?
Yeah, well, so on the question of leadership, I would say, I am temperamentally, I think, a pretty idealistic person. And in my ideal, everybody would be a leader. And I don't mean that in like a silly, superficial way, like everybody is a king or everybody is awesome or something. But I think in any, let's say, communal situation where people gather to solve problems and engage in collective activity, which is what leadership is about, right? It's about getting people involved in a larger enterprise than what they would do as individuals or members of a family or something like that. So in every one of those situations, I would like to see everybody know how to make the best contribution. In other words, lead. I would like everybody to know to look for opportunities to step up, share information as necessary, to persuade their fellow community members as necessary, to take responsibility for things as necessary. And again, in this kind of turn-taking or sharing scenario. I realize that's idealistic, but that's where I'm coming from when I think of leadership training. I'm not just thinking of let's have better kings or let's have better CEOs or presidents or something like that. I really mean it for everybody. And so to bring it back to what you're talking about with higher education, which is where I really started applying this idea of the heroic journey. I don't know if they have this in Portugal, but in pretty much most, certainly not all, but most American colleges and universities, institutions of higher education, somewhere in the mission, there will be language of we're here to train leaders, we're here to produce leaders, and so forth and so on. And I don't think you can really become a leader. This is a longer conversation, but I don't think you can really become a leader until you know who you are, what you're good at, what is the special contribution you can make to your community, what your strengths and weaknesses are, what you're passionate about. And that's the hero's journey is really all about that. I mean, it's pitched as a coming of age story, a maturation story, but the hero, begins the journey by not wanting to go on the journey and then finding a reason why to go on the journey. So it's coming in contact with your passions and interest, and then the journey itself is all about a series of trials of physical strength, trials of self-restraint, of cleverness, these kinds of things. And so my hope for higher education would be that it does more to activate students in thinking about, first of all, like, what bothers you about the world. When you look at the world, probably it doesn't seem perfect to you. It doesn't seem ideal to you. It might seem sick or unjust or ugly or ignorant or whatever. Pick the thing that really bothers you, and then let's see if we can design a quest for you, a journey to address those things that you care most about. I mean, I know just from talking to you, Ricardo, you're concerned about ignorance, right? Concerned about ignorance, concerned about enlightenment, and so you're on this journey right now, trying to educate yourself and educate other people. And 5 years from now, you'll have many great war stories to tell about this journey that you've been on. And my wish for higher education would be that we could replicate that a little bit more regularly, because right now we're not doing that very well.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So, and now talking about, because we already talked about the psychological traits that the ancients, and Xenophon in particular, nominated for a leader, but nowadays in psychology we have a better method, that is the big 5 personality traits. What would you say should be the personality traits that a leader should have according to the big 5?
All of them and none of them, right? I mean, seriously, we could think of a scenario probably where, let's say, someone who's open to new experiences would be, ideal for a leadership role. Whereas we could probably think of scenarios where someone who's not open to new experiences would be good for the leadership role. A situation, that requires traditional knowledge and traditional experience. Right. I mean, for a lot of, I'm not saying I want Trump as my leader, but for a lot of people, Donald Trump is not open to new experiences. He's very traditional. He's very set in his ways. And some people find that very reassuring. Some people might find that very reassuring in a parent, right? Because it feels like stability. And I'm not an expert on the big 5 traits, but correct me if I'm wrong, there's not anything that's supposed to be normative or positive or valuable about having those 5 traits as opposed to not having those 5 traits. They're just there to predict your behavior and explain other things, right? There's nothing better. So being conscientious versus not conscientious, that can be good and bad, right? Some people are too conscientious and it makes them stressed and anxious, and they can't function socially because they're always thinking about what did that last sentence that Ricardo said mean. I I want to please him. I want to make sure, he understands me. Like their mental gears can grind to a halt by being too conscientious, right? Or being too agreeable. There's a value to being disagreeable in certain situations, right?
Yeah, yes, that's correct. And even from evolutionary psychology, we know that we have a lot of variation among human populations in what refers to the big five personality traits, because it's important to have all different kinds of people in society for a society to function well, let's say.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's the big five. And now, what areas of knowledge nowadays should a leader be versed in?
All of them. I mean, I think these days, well, I guess part of it depends on the type of leader. Like if you're asking me about a baseball coach, what does that coach need versus what does a politician need? I mean, I think if we're thinking about a political leader, you always have to have a knowledge of what is good, right? And I don't mean that in like a trite and trivial way. I mean, like even if you're a baseball coach, you have to on some level think about is what I'm doing good for the team, and not just good for winning, but is it good for the health of the players? Is it good for their own livelihood, right? If you're if you really care about them, it's not just can you get them to hit the ball well or something like that. So yeah, I mean, I would say that knowledge of the good, like what is a good life? What are the things in life that make us most happy, and what are the things that we should be? What should a career do for us as human beings? What should our personal relationships do? What should our knowledge do? Maybe they should be ends in themselves, right? So I would say for any leader, and I'm stressing this now because I think not a lot of leaders are encouraged to think along these ways. I think a lot of leaders in business or politics or technology don't spend enough time wrestling with these questions. And I'm not saying I have all the answers to them. I just think as a society we should be asking them a lot more. I mean, the other big things I think would just involve kind of directions in technology, directions in cybersecurity. All of these. I mean, these are very what's going to happen with social media, right? What are the consequences of social media in so many different areas? They are vast, and they're going to be even more vast. And I think we need a lot more brain power wrestling with them.
Mm-hmm. And because nowadays we have a lot of scientific psychological knowledge, wouldn't you say that to be an effective political leader nowadays, that people should be at least somewhat versed, or at least know something coming from psychology, because they're dealing with other humans?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the do you know about the Goldwater Rule?
No.
So in 1964, Barry Goldwater ran for president against Lyndon Johnson. He ultimately lost, but while he was campaigning, a number of psychiatrists came out and said that he was unfit. He was psychologically unfit to be president, and in their denunciation of him, they even found fault with his manliness, and no one today would say psychologically you're unmanly or something like this, but that's what they accused him of. And then afterwards, as a kind of a matter of reflection, they decided that it was inappropriate for a psychiatrist to evaluate a public figure that they had not themselves sat down to interview and analyze, right? So you would never analyze an actor based on the roles that they had played in movies, right? You wouldn't say Jack Nicholson is a psychopath because he's played psychopaths in film. And the argument could be that a public figure is merely playing a role. So what business do psychiatrists or anybody else have in evaluating them? And so for years, there has been this rule that it's called the Goldwater Rule, that where they don't evaluate them. But then when Trump became president or was campaigning, people thought that, here is such a clear example of a narcissist, if not a psychopath, someone who's paranoid, that this community felt really compelled to kind of step up and speak out about this, because people like you and me, who are not expert in this, were kind of left to use psychological constructs in a very unprofessional way, sometimes a very careless and a reckless way. It's not, we've been talking about psychopathy here, but I'm not qualified to diagnose someone as a psychopath. If they came to me, like, you need years of training and expertise to do this. So it's this very tricky kind of moral and political question. But as I say, the danger is, if you don't have more psychiatrists training people in applying these constructs, then they just apply them very sloppily, and then everybody gets, you just call your enemy a narcissist. It's not, it doesn't mean anything.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I have a final question, but just before that, something crossed my mind now, because we've been talking about all of these traits that a leader should have and so on. But it seems to me, at least from what I know from personality psychology and evolutionary psychology, that most, if not all of these traits are more associated with masculinity. What would you say, for example, risk-taking, for example, the need to be assertive, for example, the need to be now and then a bit disagreeable, to have things done, and things like that. What would you say is the place for femininity in these leadership traits, and the place of women in politics and leadership?
Well, that's a huge question. I'm trying to think about how to parse that. First off, I would say I feel that there are tons of women who do not have access or opportunities to participate in leadership roles for a whole host of reasons. Some of it has to do with these constructs of masculinity and femininity. I'm not saying there aren't biological differences among human beings, and that sometimes these fall along the lines of gender. But I mean, I happen to know personally plenty of awesome female leaders, plenty of female leaders who want to lead more and be more involved in leadership roles. And as I say, like, culturally speaking, the opportunities are not there. I mean, even going back to the ancient world, like the system of Athenian pederasty, the love of young boys that existed in Athens, where an older man would be attracted to a younger man and sponsor that man on his leadership career. There's not really an equivalent of that in the ancient world or now, where a young girl is told at 8 or 10 or whatever, like, hey, you've got this mentor out there, you've got this sponsor who's going to help you become a congresswoman one day. Like, so we don't have that structure in place. Now, as far as like masculinity and femininity, those are constructs. I mean, I'm not saying that they don't have a biological connection to them, but they are constructs that change massively over time. So for example, like Cyrus, in the case of Xenophon, who's celebrated as this fantastic leader, he has what even to the Greeks and the Persians might have been seen as feminine traits, but he blends them perfectly. Like he likes nice things. He's a man of style. He cries. He's very sympathetic. He's very empathetic, and it's just that level of versatility that makes him such a great leader. In other words, he is what the situation calls for, and if that calls for greater gentleness in one situation, he uses it. If it calls for assertiveness in another situation, he uses it there. But there are plenty of times like it. I don't. This gets back to my definition at the outset of leadership. Like, is assertiveness a good leadership trait? Certainly, assertiveness is a trait that many leaders show now. It's a trait that they used in order to get to the leadership role. But is it doing us any good? Does it do us any good when two people just try to assert themselves, but neither of them really knows what the situation calls for? They just know they want to be the one calling the shots. Like, whether it's a man or a woman engaged in that activity, it boils down to, can you provide people with what they need, and can you help them become what they need to become? And I'm sure we can all think of men and women, transgender individuals, anybody in our lives can help us achieve those two things. And if they can achieve those two things, then they're leaders. And we need to look for more of them, and we need to celebrate them. So that's my approach to this as a humanist.
Yeah, great. So, and since you're also very interested in education and perhaps in improving education, in what ways would you say universities nowadays fail in promoting the creation and development of future leaders, being political leaders or other kinds of social leaders?
Yeah, I would say I think it starts with not thinking enough about what they mean by training leaders. All universities, like I say, or most of them, claim to be doing this in some capacity, but they don't begin with a very careful definition of it, nor do they give. I don't think they give students an opportunity to learn enough about themselves, to learn about what they care about. Just as you and I were talking about even before we began this interview. Find out what you're passionate about, and I'm not really pointing the finger at any individual or even administrators when I say this, because I know they feel pressure to make their university profitable. More and more universities are seen as training grounds for a future career in something, and universities can get funding if they can show that their students are becoming employed. But just having a job and a career doesn't mean you're a leader. In fact, in a lot of ways, it might mean you're the opposite of a leader, because all you're doing is thinking about how to do that one job, right? You said, you have a background in dentistry. Like, did you ever have a chance to think about what's the role of dentistry in society? Do we have enough dentists? Do we have too many dentists? Is dentistry too expensive? Like, all of these things. Young people don't have, and it's not to say that you're going to answer all these questions, but you need to be activated, I think, at a young age to start wrestling with them, because we're still going to wrestle with them. I still wrestle with them. I don't have even most of the answers, but so universities, I think, need to start with the idea that leadership is something more than just having a high-paying career, a high-paying job or something.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I guess we will end it there. And Norman, thank you a lot for having accepted my invitation and for being here with us today. I think it was really an interesting conversation. And so thank you.
Thank you. I'd be happy to do it again, Ricardo. And especially thank you for your philomatheia, your curiosity, and your love of humanity, for reaching out across the globe and bringing people into this community. I hope your community grows. I hope you get honor for it. I hope you're recognized and celebrated. And I'd be happy to talk to you again. I really appreciate your questions.
Okay, so thank you a lot for that. Thank you a lot
pleasure.
for the kind words. If you appreciate my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/thedissenter. Thank you.